Section 1 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 20. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 20, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 1. The Little Visitor, by Elizabeth Oakes Smith. 10 to 1, the home baby is the prettier of the two, although its face is half hid. I am sure it must be prettier than the little visitor, with her broad staring eyes and prodigious forehead. That forehead, well, that is the way heads are becoming in our country. The women all write, learn their allergies, discuss politics, and talk of the march of the mind. And then the men make speeches, get earnest every 3 weeks over some petty election, and furious every 4 years about the presidential. The result will be that heads will become foreheads. There will be no space for the affections. People will think, and after a while go mad over some absurdity or other. You see, this is Emma Carey's first hopeful. People never send the second or third round to visit the neighbors. And as for any above those numbers, being named as a little visitor, it would be the height of the ridiculous. Mary Manton, the pretty Mrs. Manton, with pouting lips and a proud, pettish air, alas for alliteration, is looking half jealous at the notice little Anna attracts, though in her soul she knows her child is twice as handsome. What mother doesn't? I wish there were something about the little visitor suggestive of something besides well-to-do-ativeness, but there isn't. She evidently sucks her thumb in genial content. Her lymphatic plumpness gives no presentiment of impending evil. No coming events cast their shadows before. She anticipates womanhood by the tenacious quest of the rattle, the coquettish raising of the shapeless hand, and the already effective eyes. Alas for Harry Manton. He begins to be victimized even now. We wish there was something less benign in the aspects of things about the little visitor, and then a story might be written, such as would be read. But it is otherwise. All is genial as it should be about the innocent and the beautiful. Happiness is diffused like the sunshine everywhere. It is the abiding rule, and we notice only the exceptions. Indeed, so universal is the law that people affect the thing even when it does not exist, as though there was something questionable in grief. In this way, novels and romances are in good repute with the inexperienced and the happy, for they deal in the deeper emotions of the human heart, the feelings that are not of everyday recurrence, and call forth the luxury of tears. Few sorrows hath she of her own, my hope, my joy, my Genevieve, and best she loves me when I sing the songs that make her grieve. Ay, and she does so because she hath had few sorrows of her own. To those who in the agony of suffering have known the dearth of tears, so that they have exclaimed, "Oh, that mine head were waters, and mine eyes a fountain of tears," a tale of distress is appalling. Even the sad one that beguileth the unconscious tears put aside, as awakening memories that were better buried in oblivion. Such dread to have their sensibilities awakened. The real of life has made too many appeals, and when fiction donneth her iris robe, relieved by the thick cloud that giveth it form, they shrink from her as from a swindler of the heart, a trifler with the sacredness of human emotions, a voluptuary that for the gratification of a pampered fancy extorts the soul's tribute. The little visitor is too happy for romance. Fat people never suggest it. They are the matter of fact of life, the everyday bread and butter, very good, indeed, very necessary. But then the soul sometimes asketh, like Oliver Twist, for more. What can be said of the little visitor? All animals have the power to make themselves understood to one another. The two babies have established an intelligence at once. It is curious to watch their mute, yet beautiful sympathy. Do they recognize their pre-existence? Do they recall an earlier and blissful state when life was repose and flowers and sunshine? A long breathing of undefined pleasure, expressionless, unvarying, folding the being to a downy consciousness that is, and yet is not, a dreamy waking, a slumbering hopefulness, a rare tinged cloudiness where thought is the germ, minute and indistinguishable, in the unfolding corolla of being? Surely the children have a sweet recollection of such state, and their glances are those of pleasant reminiscence and mutual delight at meeting in a new country, as yet to them full of enjoyment and wonder. The inferior animals have a recognition of babyhood as something nearer to their own intelligence than the adult, hence their watchfulness over it, and their caresses expressive of mere sympathy and less reverence. I remember a pretty anecdote of a cat which really seemed to think that a baby might have a fancy for a mouse. She had lived longer than most of her species, and was remarkable for her matronly and skillful discipline. She was remarkable, too, for her attachment to her young responsibilities, restricting them to their rightful department, as if she had learned the peril of permitting them to stray beyond. She had one kitten, the last of the family, a sort of Benjamin in feline life and affection. She suffered incessant anxiety on its account, confined herself to its basket, caressed it, played with it, and then when the playful creature slept with exhaustion, Puss took her accustomed position upon the window-sill, folded her paws beneath her dainty chest, and luxuriated in the sunshine. The least sound from Kitty drew her with a quick cry from her place, and all her solicitude was renewed. At length, when Puss found it necessary to renew her mousing expeditions to the larder, Benjamina became the gift of a curly-pated little gypsy in the neighborhood. Puss returned and grew half frantic at her bereavement. With a mouse yet struggling with life in her mouth, she went from room to room in her search. Where a door impeded her, she would put the mouse under her paw, making piteous cries till it was opened. She would then inspect every corner of the apartment. Holding the mouse in her mouth, she would leap upon tables, bookcases, and turn aside curtains till convinced it was all in vain. In this way, the whole house was examined, and she returned slowly to the nursery. Here, a child just beginning to sit erect was beating his rattle upon the floor. Puss looked on for a while. There must have been the strugglings of thought in its poor cranium, thought growing out of its outraged maternity. She crushed the mouse she held in her mouth, and then softly approaching the child, laid it upon its lap. Of course, the baby took it up to convey it where everything goes at that age of being, and Pussy laid her head down and purred in content. End of section 1. Section 2 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 20. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 20, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 2. The Story of Captain Bird, or the First Capital Conviction under the Constitution of the United States, by Seba Smith. "Sell O!" cried young Walter Jordan from the masthead of the fishing schooner Betsy as she was plowing her way before a strong east wind across Casco Bay in the then province of Maine and heading for Falmouth, now Portland, harbor. "Where away?" called out Skipper Jordan, who was standing at the helm and watching the boys as they were preparing to take a reef in the mainsail. 3 points on our weather quarter," said Walter. "I see her," said the skipper. "Come down and hand me the spyglass." Walter hastened down and brought the spyglass to his father. "Steady the helm," said the skipper, as he took the glass and elevated it toward the distant vessel. "She's a stranger," he added, after taking a brief look through the glass. "And by them colors she's got flying there, I guess she wants somebody to pilot her in. Come bear a hand. Get a double reef in that mainsail before the wind tears it all to pieces. And we must try to hold on a little, too, and let the vessel come up." The boys soon had the mainsail under close reef, and the little Betsy was yawing off and coming to, and tilting over the waves like a lone duck that waits for its companions to come up. The strange vessel was nearing them quite fast. She proved to be a schooner of about 30 tons burden, and coming down under as much sail as she could possibly bear. She was soon alongside the Betsy. When she had come up within speaking distance, Skipper Jordan hailed her. "What schooner is that?" shouted the captain of the fishermen. "The schooner Rover, Captain Bird," was the hoarse, loud reply. "Where are you from?" "From the coast of Africa." "Where are you bound?" "To the nearest American port," said Captain Bird, who had now approached near enough for easy conversation. "Any port in a storm, you know," continued the commander of the Rover, "and I think we have a storm pretty close at hand. What port are you bound to, Captain?" "I'm bound into Falmouth," said Captain Jordan, "which is the nearest port there is, and it isn't more than 10 miles into the harbor. If you ain't acquainted with our coast, you just follow in my wake, and I'll pilot you in." The captain of the Rover thanked Skipper Jordan for his politeness and kept his vessel in the wake of the Betsy till they entered the beautiful harbor of Falmouth. The town of Falmouth formed one side of the harbor and Cape Elizabeth the other, and as Captain Jordan belonged to the latter place, after making a graceful curve through the channel, he brought his vessel to anchor near the Cape Elizabeth shore. The Rover came up and anchored but a few rods distant. It was now near night. The strong east wind that was driving into the harbor began to be accompanied by a thick beating rain, and as soon as his sails were snugly furled and the little Betsy prepared to ride out the storm, Captain Jordan and his boys hastened on shore to join the family circle from whom they had been absent on a 4 weeks' cruise. The storm continued through the next day, with heavy wind and copious rain. Numerous vessels had come into the harbor during the night to escape from the perils of an easterly storm on the rough and dangerous coast of Maine, and in the morning their naked masts were seen rocking to and fro, like leafless trees in the autumn winds. The inhabitants of the Falmouth and Cape Elizabeth were but little abroad on that day, but many a spyglass were pointed from the window on both sides of the harbor to scan the different vessels that were there at anchor. None attracted more attention or elicited more remark than the little Rover. She seemed to be a strange bird among the flock. All said she was not a coaster, and it was obvious she was not a fisherman. She had a strange kind of foreign look about her that induced the inhabitants pretty unanimously to decide that she didn't belong anywhere about in these parts. The storm passed over. The next day was clear and pleasant, and a gentle wind was blowing from the northwest. The transient vessels in the harbor, one after another, shook out their sails to the breeze, glided smoothly along the channel, and put to sea. Before 9 o'clock, all were gone except the strange little schooner and the vessels that belonged to the port, or such as were their waiting cargo. But day after day passed away, and the little Rover still remained at anchor. It could not be discovered that she had any special object in her visit to Falmouth. She had brought no cargo to the town, and did not seem to be looking for one. Her whole crew consisted of but 3 men, who were on shore every day at Falmouth or Cape Elizabeth, and entering into various little barter trades with the inhabitants. Public curiosity began to be considerably excited in regard to the strange vessel, and whenever the crew were on shore, their movements were observed with increasing attention. Day after day, and even week after week, had now elapsed since the Rover came into port, and there she still remained at anchor, and her crew were spending most of their time in idleness, and no one could discover that they had any definite object ahead. Mysterious whispers and vague rumors began to be afloat among the community, of a character so grave and awful as to excite the attention of the public authorities. The time of which we are now speaking was the month of July, in the year 1789. The Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts was then holding a session at Falmouth, in the District of Maine, and the session was near its close. When these mysterious rumors respecting the schooner Rover reached the ears of the court, the judges deemed it their duty, before the court should adjourn, to inquire into the matter. They accordingly sent for Robert Jordan and William Dyer, 2 young men of Cape Elizabeth, from whom many of the reports in circulation were said to have emanated. Robert and William, being brought before the court, were questioned as to what they knew concerning the schooner Rover and her crew. Robert said he didn't know nothing about 'em, only he knew when they was piloting of her in with the little Betsy. He heard the captain tell father they come from the coast of Africa. But what they came clear from Africa here for, without any cargo, and were staying here so long, without trying to get anything to do, was more than he could tell. Well, have you never said, inquired the judge, that you didn't believe, but that there had been murder committed on board of that vessel? And if so, please too state to the court what were the circumstances which caused your suspicions. Why, replied Robert, William and I have been aboard of her a good many times, being she lies off abreast of our house, and a number of times we've stayed aboard in the evening and played cards with the men. They tell so many different stories about their voyage and talk so queer about it that I never could tell what to make of it. They most always had some punch or wine to drink when we was playing, and after we'd played till they got to be considerable well along in the evening, they would sometimes get pretty merry. Sometimes they said they had come right from England and hadn't been out but 20 days when they arrived here. And sometimes they said they'd been cruising on the coast of Africa 3 months to get a load of niggers but couldn't catch 'em. And then one of 'em says, how many times you think old Hodges has looked over the ship nudes to try to find our latitude and longitude? And then he looked at the others and winked, and then they all laughed. And one time it was a pretty dark evening. They had drinked up all the liquor there was in the cabin, and Captain Bird told Hanson to go into the hold and bring up a bottle of wine. Hanson kind of hesitated a little and looked as if he didn't want to go, and said he didn't believe, but they had wine enough, and he didn't want to go poking down in the hold in the night. At that, Captain Bird called him a pretty baby and asked him what he was afraid of, and wanted to know if he was afraid he should see Connor there. And then Captain Bird ripped out a terrible oath and swore he'd have some wine if the DL was in the hold, and he went and got a bottle and give us all another drink. When he came back again, Hanson asked him if he see anything of Connor there, and Captain Bird swore he'd throw the bottle of wine at his head if he didn't shut up. Another time I was aboard in the daytime, and I see a parcel of red spots on the cabin floor, and up along the gangway that looked as if there'd been blood there. And I asked them what that was, and they said it wasn't nothing, only where they'd butchered a whale. And then they all laughed again and looked at each other and winked. And that's pretty much all I know about the matter. May it please your honor, said Robert, bowing to the judge. William Dyer, being examined and questioned, his testimony agreed with that of Robert Jordan in every particular, with the addition of one other fact. He said, when he was on board the Rover one day, he noticed a little round hole in a board in the after part of the cabin that looked as if it might have been made by a bullet from a gun. And there was a parcel of smaller holes spattered around it that looked like shot holes, and he took his penknife and dug out a shot from one of them. And when I asked them, said William, what they'd been shooting there, Hanson said that was where Captain Bird shot a porpoise when they was on the coast of Africa. And then they looked at each other and laughed. These circumstances, related so distinctly and minutely by 2 witnesses, were adjudged by the court to be of sufficient importance to warrant the apprehension and examination of the crew of the Rover. Accordingly, measures were immediately taken to have them brought before the court. An officer was dispatched with proper authority to arrest them, and taking with him 8 assistants well armed with muskets, he put off in a yawl boat to board the schooner. The officer stood at the helm and had command of the boat, while 2 of the men were placed at the oars, and 6 stood with their guns all loaded and primed, and ready to give battle, in case resistance should be offered. When the crew of the Rover beheld the boat approaching, and observed the formidable appearance of the armed men, they were perfectly panic-struck. The thought flashed across their minds with the rapidity and vividness of lightning, that by some unaccountable secret means or other, their guilt had become known, and they were about to be brought to a just retribution for their crimes. They stood a moment, gazing, first at the boat and then at each other, with a vacant and irresolute stare. The captain then sprang hastily to the capstan and ordered the men to help get the anchor on board. They flew to their handspikes and gave 2 or 3 rapid heaves at the capstan, but a moment's thought told them there would not be time to get the anchor on board before the boat would be alongside. Captain Bird then caught an axe, and cutting the cable at a single blow, ordered the men to run up the foresail. The foresail and the jib were immediately set, and the schooner began to move before a light breeze down the harbor. Her speed, however, was slow, compared with that of the pursuing boat, for as soon as the officer perceived the schooner was making sail, he directed 2 more of his men to lay down their guns, and put out a couple of extra oars. The 4 oarsmen now buckled down to their work, and the boat was leaping over the water at a rate that struck terror into the heart of Bird and his companions. "Hiss the mainsail!" cried Bird to his men, as soon as the schooner was fairly heading on her course. "Spring for your lives! Get on all sail as fast as possible, If we can get around that point so as to take the wind before they overhaul us, we'll show them that we can make longitude faster than they can." The men redoubled their exertions. Every sail was made to draw to the utmost of its power, but it was all in vain. The boat was rapidly gaining upon the schooner, and before she had reached the narrows between Cape Elizabeth and House Island, the boat was alongside, and the officer commanded Captain Bird to heave to. The order was not obeyed, and the schooner kept on her course. The officer repeated his command, and told Bird if he didn't heave to immediately, he'd shoot him down as he stood at the helm. At the same moment, he directed 2 of his assistants to point their guns and take good aim. Bird, perceiving the muskets leveled at his head, darted from the helm and leaped down the companionway, landing at a single bound on the cabin floor. His companions followed with equal precipitation and left the Rover to steer her own course and fight her own battles. The vessel, no longer checked by the helm, soon rounded to, and the officer and his men jumped on board. On looking down into the cabin, they perceived the 3 men were armed, Bird with a musket and the others with a cutlass and handspike, and bidding defiance to their assailants. The officer quietly closed the companionway, and having some men with him who understood working a vessel, they soon beat up the harbor again and made fast to one of the wharves on the Falmouth side. The wharf was lined with people who had been eagerly watching the result of the chase, and who now jumped on board in crowds and thronged the vessel. The companionway was again opened, and Bird and his men were ordered up. Perceiving there were altogether too many guns for them on board, they came quietly up and surrendered themselves to the officer. On being taken to the courthouse, they were placed in separate rooms and examined severally. The first, who claimed to be commander of the vessel, said he was an Englishman by birth, and that his name was Thomas Bird. The second said he was a Swede, and his name was Hans Hansen. The third, whose name was Jackson, said he was an American and belonged to Newtown in the state of Massachusetts. They seemed to possess little confidence in each other, and each feeling apprehensive that the others would betray him, and supposing the one who made the earliest and fullest confession would be likely to receive the lightest punishment, they all confessed, without hesitation, that the captain of the Rover had been killed on voyage. But all endeavored to urge strong palliating circumstances to do away with criminality of the deed. They severally agreed that the vessel was owned by the Hodges in England, that their captain's name was Connor, and that they had been trading some time on the coast of Africa, that Captain Connor was rough and arbitrary and abused his men beyond endurance, and that in a moment of excitement they had sought revenge by taking his life. They all agreed, too, as to the manner in which the deed was done and the time and place. It was in the nighttime. They were in the cabin. Captain Connor had been very abusive and overbearing, and Bird, who was more highly provoked than he could bear, hastily caught up a gun, which stood in the cabin, loaded with ball, and shot Connor dead on the spot. They were then exceedingly frightened at what had been done, and tried to dress his wounds and bring him to. But there were no signs of returning life, and they took him on deck and threw him into the sea. They were then afraid to return to England with the vessel, and after many long consultations, they concluded to come to the United States, dispose of such articles as they had on board, sell the vessel the first opportunity they should meet with, and separate and go to their respective countries. Upon this examination and confession, the court committed them to jail in Falmouth to await their trial for the piratical murder of Connor on the high seas. At this period, the Supreme Judicial Court of the several states, with the maritime or admiralty judge, were, by an ordinance of the old Congress, authorized to try piracy and felony committed on the high seas. But before the next session of the Supreme Judicial Court of Falmouth or Cumberland County, the new Congress, under the federal Constitution, had passed a Judiciary Act establishing the United States courts. By this act, piracies and felonies on the high seas were committed to the jurisdiction of the Circuit Court of the United States. Although the officers of this court were inducted into office in December 1789, the court held no session at Falmouth for trials till June 1790. At this term of the court, the case of Bird and his companions was taken up. Jackson was permitted to become state's evidence and was used as a witness. The grand jury, of whom Deacon Titcomb was foreman, found a bill against Bird as a principal for the murder of Connor on the high seas, and against Hansen for being present and aiding and abetting him therein. The prisoners were arraigned at the bar of the court, and pleading not guilty, the court assigned them counsel and prepared for the trial, which commenced on Friday morning. So strong was the public excitement on the occasion, and so great was the crowd assembled at the trial, that the court adjourned for the meeting-house of the first parish, the desk of which at that time was occupied by the Reverend Thomas Smith, the first minister settled in Falmouth. Deacon Chase of Pepperell, now Sacco, was foreman of the jury. The cause was heard and argued on both sides in due form. The jury retired, and in the evening of the same day came in with their verdict. Bird was placed at the bar, and the names of the jury were called over. The clerk then put the question, "What say you, Mr. Foreman? Is Bird, the prisoner of the bar, guilty or not guilty?" "Guilty," replied the foreman in a low and solemn tone. Bird dropped his head and sallied back upon the seat. Although he had no reason to anticipate a different verdict, yet he did not seem to realize its awful import until the sound fell upon his startled ear. His brain reeled for a moment, and darkness was gathering before his eyes. But tears came to his relief. He hid his face in his handkerchief and wept like a child. When the same question was put to the jury in reference to Hanson, the reply was, "Not guilty." On Saturday morning, the court met again, and the prisoner was brought in to receive his sentence. Mr. Sims, one of the prisoner's counsel, made a motion in arrest of judgment, because the latitude and longitude of the sea, where the crime was committed, was not named in the indictment. The court overruled his motion and proceeded to pronounce sentence of death. As this was the first capital conviction in a court of this republic after the federal constitution was adopted, the counsel of Bird concluded, on that account, to petition the President of the United States for his pardon, and thus make another and last effort to save his life. Accordingly, a copy of the indictment and all the proceedings in the case was forwarded to General Washington, then residing in New York. But the President, with that sound wisdom and clear-sightedness for which he was so remarkable, declined interfering with the sentence of the court, either by pardon or reprieve. And that sentence was executed upon Bird by Marshal Dearborn and his assistants on the last Friday of the same month of June, 1790. End of section 2.
Section 3 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 20. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Greg Giordano. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 20. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 3. First Love, or Constancy in the 19th Century, by Miss L. E. Landon. The assertion that what is everybody's business is nobody's is true enough, but the assertion that what is nobody's business is everybody's is still truer. Now, a love affair, for example, is, of all others, a thing apart, an enchanted dream where common griefs and cares come out. It is like a matrimonial quarrel, never to be benefited by the interference of others. It is a sweet and subtle language that none understand but the speakers, and yet this fine and delicate spirit is most especially the object of public curiosity. It is often supposed, before it exists, is taken for granted, commented upon, continued, and ended without the consent of the parties themselves, though a casual observer might suppose that they were the most interested in the business. All love affairs excite the greatest possible attention, but never was so much attention bestowed as in the little town of Allerton upon that progressing between Mr. Edward Rainsforth and Miss Emily Worthington. They had been a charming couple from their birth, were called the little lovers from their cradle, and even when Edward was sent to school, his letter home upon a quarter always contained his love to his little wife. Their course of true love seemed likely to run terribly smooth, their fathers having maintained a friendship as regular as their accounts. Mr. Worthington's death, however, when Emily was just 16, led to the discovery that his affairs were on the verge of bankruptcy. Mr. Rainsforth now proved himself a true friend, He said little, but did everything. Out of his own pocket he secured a small annuity to the orphan girl, placed her in a respectable family, and asked her to dine every Sunday. With his full sanction, the little became the young lovers, and the town of Allerton, for the first time in its life, had not a fault to find with the conduct of one of its own inhabitants. The two old friends were not destined to be long parted, and a few months saw Mr. Rainsforth carried to the same churchyard whither he had so recently followed the companion of his boyhood. A year passed away, and Edward announced his intention of, pray let us use the phrase appropriated to such occasions, becoming a votary of the saffron god. The whole town was touched by his constancy, and felt itself elevated into poetry by being the scene of such disinterested affection. But for the first time in his life, Edward found there was another will to be consulted than his own. His trustees would not hear of his marrying till he was 22, the time that his father's will appointed for his coming of age. The rage and despair of the lover were only to be equalled by the rage and despair of the whole town of Allerton. Everybody said that it was the cruellest thing in the world, and some went so far as to prophesy that Emily Worthington would die of consumption before the time came of her lover's majority. The trustees were declared to have no feeling, and the young people were universally pitied. The trustees would not abate one atom of their brief authority. They had said that their ward ought to see a little of the world, an edict. Accordingly, it was settled that Edward should go into London for the next 3 months, and see how he liked studying the law. He certainly did not like the prospect at all, and his only consolation was that he should not leave his adored Emily exposed to the dissipations of Allerton. She had agreed to go and stay with an aunt, some 40 miles distant. There was not even a young curate in the neighborhood. The town of Allerton was touched to the heart by the whole proceeding. No one spoke of them but as that romantic and that devoted young couple. I own that I have known greater misfortunes in life than that a young gentleman and lady of 20 should have to wait a 12-month before they were married. But every person considers their own the worst that ever happened, and Edward and Emily were miserable to their heart's content. They exchanged locks of hair, and Emily gave him a portfolio, embroidered by herself, to hold the letters that she was to write. He saw her off first, under the care of an old servant, to the village where she was to stay. She waved her white handkerchief from the window as long as she could see her lover, and a little longer, then sank back in a flood of falling pearl, which men call tears. Edward was as wretched as he was also exceedingly uncomfortable, which helps wretchedness on very much. It was a thorough wet day. All his things were packed up, for he himself was to start in the afternoon when the mail passed through, and never was a young gentleman more utterly at a loss what to do with himself. In such a case an affair of the heart is a great resource, and young Rainsforth got upon the coach-box, looking quite unhappy enough to satisfy the people of Allerton. It must be owned that he and the weather equally brightened up in the course of a couple of stages. To be sure, a cigar has a gift of placidity peculiarly its own. If I were a woman, I should insist upon my lover's smoking. If not of much consequence before, it will be an invaluable qualification after, the happiest day of one's life. In these days roads have no adventure. They might exclaim, with the knife grinder, "Story! Lord bless you, I have none to tell." We will therefore take our hero after he was 4 days in London. He is happy in a lover's good conscience, for that very morning he had written a long letter to his beloved Emily, the 3 first days having been, like a teetotum in a twirl. He had been forced to neglect that duty so sweet and so indispensable to an absent lover. He had, however, found time to become quite domesticated in Mr. Alfred's family. Mr. Alfred was of the first eminence in his profession, and had 2 or 3 other young men under his charge. But it was soon evident that Edward was a first-rate favourite with the mother and 2 daughters at all events. They were fine-looking girls, and who understood how to look their best. They were well dressed, and it is wonderful how much the hair, done to a turn, ribands which make a complexion, and an exquisite chaussure set off a young woman. Laura taught him to waltz, and Julia began to sing duets with him. Now, these are dangerous employments for a youth of 21. The heart turns round, as well as the head sometimes, in a sauteuse, and then it is difficult to ask these tender questions appropriated to duties, such as, "Tell me, my heart, why wildly beating? Canst thou teach me to forget?" etc., without some emotion. A week passed by, and the general postman's knock, bringing with it letters from his trustees, who, as an item in his accounts, mentioned that he had just heard that Miss Emily Worthington was quite well, and put him in mind that he had not heard from her himself. Oh, how ill-used he felt! He had had some thoughts of writing to overwhelm her with reproaches for her neglect, but on second thoughts he resolved to treat her with silent disdain. To be sure, such a method of showing his contempt took less time and trouble than writing 4 pages to express it would have done. That evening he was a little out of spirits, but Julia showed so much gentle sympathy with his sadness, and Laura rallied him so pleasantly upon it, that they pursued the subject long after there was any occasion for it. The week became weeks. There was not a drawback to the enjoyment of the trio, excepting now and then some old friends of Papa, to whom we must be civil. Not, said Laura, but that I would put up with one and all, excepting that odious Sir John Belmore. Edward had been in town 2 months and a fortnight, when one evening Julia, they had been singing Meet Me by Moonlight alone, asked him to breakfast with him. "I have," said she, "some commissions, and Papa will trust me with you." He breakfasted, and attended the blue-eyed Julia to Swan and Edgar's. "Now I have some conscience," exclaimed she, with one of her sweet, languid smiles. Julia had an especially charming smile. It so flattered the person to whom it was addressed. It was that sort of smile which it is impossible to help taking as a personal compliment. "I have a little bit of shopping to do, bargains to buy, nettling silks to choose, and you will never have patience to wait. Leave me here for an hour, and then come back. Now be punctual. Let me look at your watch. Ah, it is just 11. Good-bye. I shall expect you exactly at 12. She turned into the shop with a most becoming blush, so pretty that Edward had half a mind to have followed her in, and quoted Moore's lines. "Oh, let me only breathe the air, the blessed air that's breathed by thee." But a man has a natural antipathy to shopping, and even the attraction of a blush, and a blush especially of that attractive sort, one on your own account, even that was lost in the formidable array of ribands, silks, and bargains. Bought because they may be wanted, wanted because they may be had. Accordingly he lounged into his club, and the hour was almost gone before he arrived at Swan and Edgar's. Julia told him she had waited, and he thought, what a sweet temper she must have, not to show the least symptom of dissatisfaction. On the contrary, her blue eyes were even softer than usual. By the time they arrived at her father's door, he had also arrived at the agreeable conclusion that he could do no wrong. They parted hastily, for he had a tiresome business appointment. However, they were to meet in the evening, and 1,000 little tender things which he intended to say occupied him till the end of his walk. When the evening came, after a toilette of that particular attention which in 9 cases out of 10 one finds leisure to bestow on oneself, he arrived at Mr. Alford's house. The first object that caught his attention was Laura, looking, as the Americans say, dreadful beautiful. She had on a pink dress, direct from Paris, that flung round its own atmosphere de rose, and nothing could be more finished than her whole ensemble. Not that Edward noted the exquisite perfection of all the feminine and Parisian items which complemented her attire, but he was struck by the general effect. He soon found himself, he scarcely knew how, quite devoted to her, and his vanity was flattered, for she was the belle of the evening. It is amazing how much our admiration takes its tone from the admiration of others, and when to that is added an obvious admiration of ourselves, the charm is irresistible. "Be sure," said Laura, in that low, confidential whisper which implies only to one could it be addressed, "if you see me bored by that weariful Sir John Belmore, to come and make me waltz. Really, papa's old friends make me quite undutiful." There was a smile accompanying the words, which seemed to say that it was not only to avoid Sir John that she desired to dance with him. The evening went off most brilliantly, and Edward went home with the full intention of throwing himself at the fascinating Laura's feet the following morning, and, what is much more, he got up with the same resolution. He hurried to Harley Street, and how propitious the fates are sometimes, found the Dame de ses Pensées. An offer is certainly a desperate act. The cavalier longs to speak, and yet shrinks back, as from a stream in winter, though the chill be but a moment. Edward certainly felt as little fear as a gentleman well could do, under the circumstances. He therefore lost no time in telling Miss Alford that his happiness was in her hands. She received the intelligence with a very pretty look of surprise. "Really," exclaimed she, "I never thought of you but as a friend, and last night I accepted Sir John Belmore. As that is his cabriolet, I must go down to the library to receive him. We should not be so interrupted here with morning visitors." She disappeared, and at that moment Edward heard Julia's voice singing on the stairs. It was the last that they had sung together. "Who shall school the heart's affection? Who shall banish its regret? If you blame my deep dejection, teach, oh teach me to forget." She entered, looking very pretty, but pale. "Ah," thought Edward, "she is vexed that I allowed myself to be so engrossed by her sister last night." "So you are alone!" exclaimed she. "I have such a piece of news to tell you. Laura is going to be married to Sir John Belmore. How can she marry a man she positively despises?" "It is very heartless," replied Edward, with great emphasis. "Nay," replied Julia, "but Laura cannot live without gaiety. Moreover, she is ambitious. I cannot pretend to judge for her. We never had a taste in common." "You," said Edward, "would not have so thrown yourself away." "Ah, no," answered she, looking down. "The heart is my world." And Edward thought he had never seen anything so lovely as the deep blue eyes that now looked up full of tears. Ah, too convincing, dangerously dear, in woman's eye, thy unanswerable tear. Whether Edward might have floated on the tears of the dove-eyed Julia must remain a question, for at that moment, a most unusual occurrence in a morning, Mr. Alford came into his own drawing-room. "So, madam," he exclaimed in a voice almost inarticulate from anger, "I know it all. You were married to Captain Darcy yesterday, and you, sir," turning to Edward, "made yourself a party to the shameful deception." "No," interrupted Julia. "Mr. Rainsforth believed me to be in Swan & Edgar's shop the whole time. The fact was, I only passed through it." Edward stood aghast. So the lady, instead of silks and ribbons, was buying, perhaps, the dearest bargain of her life. A few moments convinced him that he was de trop, and he left the father storming, and the daughter in hysterics. On his arrival at his lodgings, he found a letter from his guardians, in which he found the following entered among other items. Miss Emily Worthington has been ill, but is now recovering. Edward cared, at this moment, very little about the health or sickness of any woman in the world. Indeed, he rather thought Emily's illness was a judgment upon her. If she had answered his letter, he would have been saved all his recent mortification. He decided on abjuring the flattering and fickle sex forever, and turned to his desk to look over some accounts to which he was referred by his guardians. While tossing the papers about, half listless, half fretful, what should catch his eye but a letter with the seal not broken? He started from his seat in consternation. Why, it was his own epistle to Miss Worthington. No wonder that she had not written. She did not even know his address. All the horrors of his conduct now stared him full in the face. Poor dear, deserted Emily! What must her feelings have been? He could not bear to think of them. He snatched up a pen, wrote to his guardians, declaring that the illness of his beloved Emily would, if they did not yield, induce him to take any measure, however desperate, and that he insisted on being allowed permission to visit her. Nothing but his own eyes could satisfy him of her actual recovery. He also wrote to Emily, enclosed the truant letter, and the following day set off for Allerton. In the meantime, what had become of the fair disconsolate? Emily had certainly quite fulfilled her duty of being miserable enough in the first instance. Nothing could be duller than the little village to which was consigned the Airdene of Allerton. Day after day she roamed, not along the beach, but along the fields toward the post office, for the letter which, like the breeze in Lord Byron's calm, came not. A fortnight elapsed, when one morning, as she was crossing the grounds of a fine but deserted place in the neighborhood, she was so struck by the beauty of some pink may that she stooped to gather it. Alas, like most other pleasures, it was out of her reach. Suddenly a very elegant-looking young man emerged from one of the winding paths and insisted on gathering it for her. The flowers were so beautiful, when gathered, that it was impossible not to say something in their praise, and flowers lead to many other subjects. Emily discovered that she was talking to the proprietor of the place, Lord Elmsley, and of course apologized for her intrusion. He equally, of course, declared that his grounds were only too happy in having so fair a guest. Next they met by chance again, and at last the only thing that made Emily relapse into her former languor was a wet day, for then there was no chance of seeing Lord Elmsley. The weather, however, was generally speaking delightful, and they met and talked about Lord Byron, nay, read him together, and Lord Elmsley confessed that he had never understood his beauties before. They talked also of the heartlessness of the world, and the delights of solitude in a way that would have charmed Zimmerman. One morning, however, brought Lord Elmsley a letter. It was from his uncle, short and sweet, and ran thus: My dear George, Miss Smith's guardians have at last listened to reason, and allow that your rank is fairly worth her gold. Come up, therefore, as soon as you can, and preserve your interest with the lady. What a lucky fellow you are to have fine eyes, for they have carried the prize for you. However, as women are inconstant commodities at the best, I advise you to lose no time in securing the heiress. Your affectionate uncle, E. Tell them, said the Earl, to order post-horses immediately. I must be off to London in the course of half an hour. During this half hour he dispatched his luncheon, and, for Lord Elmsley was a perfectly well-bred, dispatched the following note to Miss Worthington, whom he was to have met that morning to show her the remains of the heronry. My dear Miss Worthington, hurried as I am, I do not forget to return the volume of Lord Byron you so obligingly lent me. How I envy you the power of remaining in the country this delightful season, while I am forced to immure myself in hurried and noisy London. Allow me to offer the best compliments of your devoted servant, Elmsley. No wonder that Emily tore the note, which she received with smiles and blushes, into 20 pieces, and did not get up to breakfast the next day. The next week she had a bad cold, and was seated in a most disconsolate-looking attire and shawl, when the letter was brought in. It contained the first epistle of Edward's, and the following words in the envelope: "My adored Emily, you may forgive me. I cannot forgive myself. Only imagine that the enclosed letter has by some strange chance remained in my desk, and I never discovered the error till this morning. You would pardon me if you knew all I have suffered, how I have reproached you. I hope to see you tomorrow, for I cannot rest till I hear from your own lips that you have forgiven your faithful and unhappy Edward." That very morning Emily left off her shawl, and discovered that a walk would do her good. The lovers met the next day, each looking a little pale, while each sat down to their own account. Emily returned to Allerton, and the town was touched to the very heart by a constancy that had stood such a test. 3 months' absence, as an old lady observed, is a terrible trial. The guardians thought so too, and the marriage of Emily Worthington to Edward Rainsforth soon completed the satisfaction of the town of Allerton. During the bridal trip the young couple were one wet day at an inn, looking over a newspaper together, and there they saw the marriage of Miss Smith with the Earl of Elmsley, and of Miss Alford to Sir John Belmore. I never heard that the readers made either of them any remark as they read. They returned to Allerton, lived very happily, and were always held up as touching instance of the first love and constancy in the 19th century. End of Section 3. Read by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 4 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 20. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 20, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 4, Ancient Battles. At the Battle of Tolosa in Spain, 1020, Muhammad al-Nahir, the Moorish emperor, was defeated with the loss of 150,000 foot and 30,000 horse slain and 50,000 prisoners by Alphonsus IX. In 1340, Alphonsus XI defeated the Moors with the slaughter of 200,000. Modern battles, even the crowning victories of Napoleon, were mere skirmishes to these almost forgotten slaughters recorded by Mariana. End of Section 4. Recording by Alan Mapstone. Section 5 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 20. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 20, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 5. Life by Lawrence Labree. Life has its springtime and season of flowers, when all things to fancy incline, and merrily pass off the airy winged hours, and hope wears an aspect divine. When memory seems clothed in a vision of light, and moments come laden with bliss, nor dream we of other worlds happy and bright, while quaffing the pleasures of this. The days of our boyhood are blithesome and gay, ere sorrow doth sadden the eye. We seize rarest treasures, then cast them away, as others float temptingly by. We heed not nor care what old time hath in store, so long as the present doth please. The future we never attempt to explore, or think that life's current may freeze. Like Adam ere tempted the sad fruit to taste, our youth is all rapture and joy. Nor deem we that life is a wearisome waste, with serpents that haunt and destroy. Each breath of the zephyr is odorous with sweets, and fancy's bright daydreams delight. And love, the young urchin, so winningly greets, we worship almost at first sight. But time will not linger, age creeps on apace, our brows become furrowed with care. We find that when closing our difficult race, we have followed but phantoms of air, and gladly relinquish the pleasures of earth, by our friends and our foes here forgiven, that the spirit may have a far happier birth, mid the splendour and glory of heaven. End of section 5. Recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 6 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 20. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Faithann Gibson. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 20. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 6. Johnny Brotherton's 5 Sunny Days. From Tales of the Borders. By John Mackay Wilson. I have experienced many days both of sorrow and of sadness in the course of my life and experience, said old John Brotherton of Peoples. But with me, bypast sorrows were always like an old almanac, a book that I never opened. Yet well do I remember the 5 sunniest days of my existence. They were days of brightness and of joy, without a spot to cloud them. They took place also at various periods of my existence. I no doubt have had, independent of them, many pleasant, warm, bonny days, days wherein I was both pleased and happy. But they passed away like any other fine days, and they were not remembered for a week. But very different from the like of these ordinary fine days were these which I allude to as the 5 sunny days of my existence. They were days of pure, unadulterated, uncloyed, almost insupportable delight. They were days, the remembered sunshine of which will not set in my breast until my life set in the grave, but I will give you an account of them. The first occurred when I was about 20 years of age. It was a delightful evening in the month of September, on the 2nd day of the month, and just about 5 minutes past 6 o'clock. I had just dropped work, for I was a soter, or more appropriately, a cordwainer, and had thrown off my apron and washed my face, and was taking a saunter up off the Tweed a bit, on the road leading down to Innerleithen. I cannot say that I had any object in view, beyond just the helpful recreation of a walk in the fields, after the labours of the day. The sun seemed to be maybe about a dozen of yards upon the hilltop, but there wasn't a cloud in the whole sky, save a wee bit yellow one, hardly broader than the brim of a Quaker's hat, that was keeking o'er the hill, as if to keep the sun. Oh, it was a glorious evening. I dare say it was never equalled at the season of the year. I am sure the leaves, poor things, that were fallen here and there from the trees and hedges, if they could have thought, would have been vexed to fall frae their branches while all nature was basking in such sunniness. I met several shearers, with their hooks or their arms, just as I was going out of the town, and I spoke to them, and they spoke to me. But some of them nodded and laughed at me, and said, "She's coming, Johnny." "Was coming," said I, and they laughed again and said, "Gang forward and see." So I went forward, and sure enough, who should I see standing beside a yet, with her hook o'er her shoulder, and picking the prickles of a day nettle out of her hand, but bonny Katy Lowry, not only the comeliest in the Borough of Peoples, but in all the wide country. I had long been desperately in love with Katy, but I had never ventured to say as mickle to her, though I was aware that she was conscious of the state of my feelings. We had often walked together on an evening, and I had gi'en her her faring, and the like o' that, but I could never get the length of talking about love or marriage, and scores of times had her and me walked by the side of each other for half an hour at a time, without either of us speaking a word beyond saying, but this is a fine night," half a dozen times o'er. So you may guess that we were a bashful couple. But on the night referred to, as I have said, I saw her standing at a yett, taking a thorn of some kind out of her hand, and I stepped forward and said to her, "What has got into your hand, Katy?" "It's a jaggy frae a nettle, I think, John," said she. "Let me try if I can tuck it out," said I. She blushed, and the setting sun just streamed across her face. I'll declare I never saw a woman look so beautiful in my born days. You might have lighted a candle at my heart at the moment, I am certain, but I did get her bonny soft hand in mine, and as I held it, I am certain I would not have exchanged that hand to have held the sceptre of the king that sits upon the throne. I soon got out the prickles, but I was so overjoyed at having her hand in mine, that when they were out I still held it in my left hand, while, whether it was by accident or how, I cannot tell, but I slipped my right hand round her waist, and in this fashion we sauntered away. But instead of going straight to town, we daundered away down to Tweedside. Weel do I remember pressing her to my breast in more than mortal joy, and of saying to her, "O Katy, Katy woman, will ye be mine? Will ye marry me, and make me the happiest man that ever put his foot in a shoe on the face of this habitable globe?" She hung her head, and, poor thing, her bosom heaved like a frightened bird's. But oh, what ecstasy it was to feel its heaving! For a good hour did I stand pressing her breast to mine, and always saying, "Will ye, Katy? Oh, will ye, woman?" At last, with a great effort, and her very heart bursting with pure affection, she flung her arms o'er my shoulders and said, "I will, John." Oh, of all the words that ever a human being heard, nothing could match the music of those 3 words to me. It was sweeter than the harp of a fairy soughing o'er a moonlit sea, when the winds of heaven are sleeping. "Oh, bless ye, forever bless ye," cried I. "Katy, ye have made me the happiest man in our peoples, and I trust I shall make ye the happiest wife." I absolutely danced with joy, and clapped my hands upon my head. If ever there was a man intoxicated with joy, it was me that night, and I am certain that her joy was nothing less than mine, though she did not express it so extravagantly. Neither the one nor the other of us heard the town clock chap 9. 3 hours flew o'er our heads as if they hadn't been 3 minutes. I set her to her feyther's door, and just as she was putting her hand upon the sneck, "Eh, John," whispered she, "where can I ha' left my hook?" "That's weel-minded," said I. "I remember I took it off your shoulder and put it o'er the yett when I was taking the prickles out of your finger." Ye may think of what both of us had been thinking about, when neither of us missed the hook or remembered leaving it till that moment. We went to seek it, with her arm through mine, and close to my side I pressed it. And there, accordingly, did we find the hook upon the yett where I had placed it. She rather feared to gang into the house, on account of her being out so late, for her feyther and mother were strict sort of folk. Therefore I volunteered to go in wi' her, and explain at once how matters stood, for bashful as I was before telling my mind to her, I had broken the ice now, and was as bold as brass. She hesitated for some time, but I urged the thing, and she consented, and into her feyther's house I went with her. I wasn't long in making the old man acquainted with the nature of my visit, and frankly asked him if he had any sort of objection to taking me for a son-in-law. "I wotna," said he, "but I dare say no. I dinna see any reasonable objection that I ought to hae. What do ye say, Tibby?" added he to his wife. "Me?" exclaimed she. "What would ye hae me to say? Johnny is a decent lad and a good tradesman, and if he likes Katy and Katy likes him, I dinna see that you or I can do anything in the matter but just leave it to their twa selves." "Weel, John," said her feyther to me, "as Tibby says, I suppose it will just have to rest between yourselves. If ye are baith agreeable, we are agreeable." I wonder I didna jump through the roof of the house. Joy almost deprived me of my specific gravity. Never since I was born had I experienced such sensations of ecstasy before. Now this was what I call my first real sunny day. It was a day of memorable joy, and joy too of a particular description, and which a man can feel but once in the course of his existence. I can say without vanity that I had always been a saving lad, and therefore in the course of 2 or 3 weeks I took a house which I furnished very respectably. And my second sunny day was that on which Katy and her feyther and her mother and a lass that was an intimate acquaintance of hers came a' to my new house together, Katy never to leave it again, for the minister just came in after them. Oh, when I heard the minister pronounce us one, and gie us his benediction as man and wife, and abune all, when I thought that she was now mine for ever, that nothing upon earth could separate us, I almost wondered that poor sinful mortals such as we are should be permitted to enjoy such unspeakable happiness on this side of time. The very tears stood in my eyes with perfect ecstasy, and I could not forbear before the minister and them a' of squeezing her hand and saying, "My ain Katy." It was October, but a very mild day, and a very sunny day. Indeed, it might, in all respects, have passed for a day in August. After dinner, the room became very warm, and the window was drawn down from the top. There was a lark singing its autumn song right abune the house, and its loud, sweet notes came pouring in by the window. Poor thing, thought I, your joys are ending, and mine are only beginning, but I trust in the autumn of my days to sing as blithely as ye do now. I gied another glance at my ain Katy, and as I contemplated her lovely countenance, I felt as a man that was never to know sorrow, for I didna see how it was possible for sorrow to be where such angel sweetness existed. That was my second sunny day, and my third followed after it in the natural course of time, for the event that rendered it memorable was neither more nor less than the birth of my first son, my only son. I was walking out in the fields when the tidings were brought to me, and when I found that I had cause to offer thanks for a living mother and a living child, with perfect joy the tears ran down my cheeks. I silently prayed for my Katy and for my bairn. When I thought that a man-son was born unto me, and that I was indeed a feyther, the pride and the joy in my heart were almost too great for me to bear. I would not have exchanged the natural and honourable title of feyther to have been made Emperor of Russia and King of Madagascar. It was a glorious day in the height of summer, and as I hurried home to see, to kiss my bairn and its mother, I believe the very flowers by the roadside were conscious that it was a feyther, a new-made feyther, that trampled on them. I did it so quickly and so lightly. But great as my joy then was, it was nothing to be compared with what I felt when I saw my Katy and our bairn, when my lips touched theirs. I then did feel the full, the overflowing ecstasy of a feyther's heart. Never shall I forget it. That was the third of my 5 sunny days. The fourth was of a different description, but gave me unmingled satisfaction, and perhaps I may say was in some sort the foundation of the one which succeeded. Now I must make you sensible that Katy made a very notable wife. In her household affairs, she set an example that was worthy of imitation by every wife in Peebles. There was naething wasted in our house, and the shadow of anything extravagant was never seen within her door. One night, about 6 weeks after our marriage, she and I were sitting at the fireside by our 2 cells, for we never made our house a house for neighbours and their clashes, when she said to me very seriously, "John, I've heard it said that the first £100 is worse to make than the next 500. "I wotna, my dear," said I, "though I say it myself. There are none belonging to the craft that can make better wages than I can, and if it is your desire to make the endeavour, with all my heart say aye." So the thing was agreed upon, and we set about it the very next day. I got a strong wooden box made, wi' a hole in the top, just about long enough and broad enough to let in a penny piece edgeways, and I caused a bit of leather, like a tongue, to be nailed o'er the inside of the hole, so that whatever was put in couldn't be taken out till the box was broken open. For many a day both her and me wrought hard, both late and early, to accomplish it. We neither allowed the back to gang bare or shabby, nor did we scrimp our coggy during our endeavours, but we avoided every sixpence, every farthing of unnecessary expense. At length Katy says to me one day, just after dinner time, "John, I dare say we shall have the £100 now. If ye have nae objection, we will open the box and see." It was the very thing which I had been wishing her to propose for months, and up I banged upon the kist, and put my hand on the head of the bed where the box was kept. It was very heavy, and required both my hands to lift it down. I forced up the lid, and having locked the door, I placed the box upon the table. The sun was streaming in at the window, sae bright that you would have said it was aware of the satisfaction of Katy and myself, as we saw it streaming upon the heap of treasure which our own industry had gathered together. It took us from 2 in the afternoon until 6 at night to count it, for it consisted of gold, silver, and copper, and we counted it thrice over before we made it come twice to the same sum. At last we were satisfied that it amounted to £115, 7 shillings, and 18 pence halfpenny. When I ascertained that the object of my desire and of my late and early savings was accomplished, I was that happy that I almost knocked o'er the table where it was all spread out, counted into parcels of 20 shillings. I threw my arms round Katy, with as mickle rapture as I did on my first sunny day, when she said, "I will, John," for the object was of her proposing, and she had the entire merit of the transaction. It was a grand sight to see the sinking sun throwing the shadows of the 100 and odd 20-shilling towers across the table and to the far side of the room. Folk talk about the beauty of rainbows, but there never was a rainbow to be compared with the appearance of our floor that evening, with all the shadows of the piles of silver running across it. That was my 4th sunny day. Finding that I was now a man of capital, I took a shop in the front street, and commenced business as a master boot and shoemaker. Katy was remarkably civil in the shop, and I always tried to put good stuff into the hands of customers, so that in a very short time I carried on a very prosperous concern. I also rose very high in the opinion of my fellow craftsmen, and wonderful to relate, I heard that it was their determination to elect me to the high and honourable office of deacon of the corporation of our ancient and respectable trade in the ancient borough of Peebles. This was a height to which my ambition never could have aspired, and when I heard of the intention of the brethren, it really made me that I couldn't sleep. It made me not only dream that I was a deacon, but a king, a prince, a bashaw, a dear kins what, but anything but plain John Brotherton. I thought it was a hoax that some of the craft were wishing to play on me. Therefore I spoke of the subject with great caution. But when it was put into my head, there was nothing on earth that I so much desired. I thought what an honour it would be when I was dead and gone, for my son to be able to say, "My father was deacon of the ancient company of cordwainers in Peebles." What a sound that will have, thought I, On the morning of the election I awoke, fearing, believing, hoping, trembling. I could hardly put on my clothes. However, the choosing of office-bearers began, and I was declared duly elected deacon of the company of corn-waiters. It was with difficulty that I refrained from clapping my hands in the court, and I am positive I would not have been able to do it had it not been that the brethren came crowding round me to shake hands with me. I went home in very high glee, as ye may well suppose, and Katy met me with great joy in her looks. When the supper was set upon the table, "Katy, my dear," said I, "send out for a bottle of strong ale." "A bottle of strong ale, John?" quoth she in surprise. "Remember that though ye have been appointed deacon of the shoemakers, ye are but a mortal man. Remember, John, that it was by drinking wholesome water with pickles of oatmeal in it that enabled you to save £100, and so to become deacon of the trade. But had ye sent for bottles of strong ale to your supper, ye would neither have saved the one, nor been made the other. Now, John, think nae mair about ale." Weel, said I, "ye are right, Katy, I canna deny it." That was what I call my 5th sunny day, a remarkable day in my existence, standing out from among the rest, and crowned wi' happiness. End of section 6.
Section 7 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 20. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Wizard Doctor. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 20, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 7. The Miser's Wife, by Elizabeth Oakes Smith. It was certainly most provoking that the pretty Mrs. G. would parade so often her little round, handsome figure in the door of their little grocery and fancy goods shop, to the evident disquietude of her husband and the annoyance of sundry beaux, who looked on her beauty and thought of Hesperian fruit, so well was she guarded by a vigilant husband and her own innocent heart. Anna was nearly 30 years younger than her husband, a little thin, keen-eyed old man, supposed to be worth a bank of money, but as nobody knew how much, everyone gave the sum according to his or her ideas in such matters. All, however, agreed he was a rich man, and Anna married him because, forsooth, the old man asked her to have him, and because her little head had got filled with thoughts of gay ribbons, handsome shoes for her little feet, and handsome dresses to show off her pretty shapes. Though it puzzled her little brain for a while to know why he should want her for a wife, yet a glance at her looking-glass solved the problem at once, and she smiled at her own prettiness, and the thought that her influence would make him a generous social being, capable of loving and being beloved, and she would have his neglected house newly furnished and painted, and she would have little parties, and walk and ride, and have abundance of new and elegant clothing. 'Twas a brilliant vision, and she would have him by all means. Now it so happened that not one of these things had entered into the cogitations of Mr. G. The girl was well enough, he thought. She had a good-natured look that pleased him, but she had other qualities that pleased him better. He had heard the schoolmaster say she was capital at figures, and he had seen her penmanship and knew she wrote a fair round hand. So he calculated the expense of keeping a clerk and a housekeeper, and he found a wife who could help tend his shop and look after his house at the same time would be much the cheapest, and he determined forthwith to make the experiment. Anna knew nothing of all this, and she married him without hesitation. Week after week passed on, and Anna was astonished to find she had no more influence over her husband than over one of his sugar casks. Everything was locked as snug from her as from anybody else, and as for his purse, she hadn't seen a farthing from it. What was she to do? Her wedding clothes had been worn everywhere. She had been told 100 times how becoming they were, and she was sick of the sound. And then they began to look a little shabby. She began to pout, and sometimes fairly cried with vexation. She might as well have pouted for an owl to see her. It is doubtful whether he observed it. She grew pale and nervous, and went to bed one day and sent word to him he must get a housekeeper, for she was sick. The old man was astounded. He had just dismissed his clerk, hoping by the help of his wife in the shop to get along without one, thus carrying into effect his original purpose of dispensing with clerk and housekeeper too. And now the thought of having to hire both again went like a dagger to his heart. What was he to do? He hastened to her bedside. Poor Anna was weeping bitterly. His heart was touched. He put his hand into his pocket, and taking out a 4-pence halfpenny, pressed it without speaking into her hand. Anna looked up, and a suppressed smile almost played over her features. If she were sick, the round fair cheek and little dimpled hand looked strangely comfortable. She looked at the 4-pence and thought how very little it would buy, and she burst into another flood of tears. Mr. G. fidgeted and fumbled in his pockets. He had never seen her act so before. "Anna, I've dismissed my clerk, and there's nobody in the shop. I thought you could help me tend and keep the accounts so that I could do without one. But if you are going to be sick, I shall have to go right off and hire another." Her face brightened. "It will be cheaper for you to employ me than another," said she. "Oh, yes, we could get along very snug if you'll help me in the shop." "Well, I'll do the best I can in the house and shop too, for $2 a week." $2 a week! Ejaculated the husband, eyeing with a wishful look the 4-pence halfpenny his wife was carelessly twirling in her taper fingers. $2 a week to my own wife, and support her into the bargain. Anna turned up her little nose at the idea of support. "Well," said she, carelessly turning her head on one side, "you can get another. His board will be something, though." "Yes, I know that. More than his wages. These fellows turn up their noses at good plain food, such as is wholesome to be eaten, and you indulge them too much in their dainty greediness. But, Anna, how often must I pay you?" "I suppose it would be cheaper at that than to get a clerk." "Every Saturday," answered Anna, with a quiet composure. "I shouldn't work a second week till the first was paid." Mr. G. groaned aloud. "Anna, what will folks say of it? Pay my own wife?" "Anna, I have to work hard. I should think you would be willing to help me without pay. I married you because I thought you superior to the rest of women, and now you serve me so." His hand unconsciously clinched his pocket, and his head sunk upon the bed. Anna was immovable. "You can get another clerk, and not pay your money to me." "Yes, but the board, and the waste." "Anna, I will pay it to you, and I will fix you a box with a hole in the cover just large enough to drop the money in. You can keep it then, and not spend it for foolish things." Anna tried to suppress a laugh, and started, considering her sickness, with amazing alacrity from her bed. She was forthwith installed into the mysteries of shopkeeping. Her books were kept in the most perfect neatness and order, and her small fingers and good eyes were just the things in selling needles, pins, and ribbons. The old man's customers increased daily. Money never came in so fast before. We will not presume to tell how it was, but scarcely ever did a passer-by catch a glimpse of Anna as she stood carelessly leaning against the post of the door, with one little foot half projecting over the sill. But he suddenly bethought himself of the necessity of purchasing a pocket-handkerchief, a few cigars, or some buttons for a coat. Some, however, came in for no other ostensible purpose than to chat awhile with the grocer's pretty wife and admire her fine eyes. Often and often did poor Mr. G. feel that he saved nothing but the board of a clerk, and the constant vigilance he was obliged to exercise was more than equivalent to that. But then his business was better, and his accounts in better order. So after wearying himself with remonstrances, he only groaned in silence. The money-box he had made for Anna contained nothing but his first and last gift, the fourpence halfpenny, and in spite of all he could urge to the contrary, Anna had expended a part of her weekly wages in painting and new furnishing their little parlor, to say nothing of the new gowns and bonnets and ribbons with which she embellished her own pretty figure. She was rigorously punctual in exacting her whole wages every Saturday, and the poor old man was obliged to comply on pain of losing her services for the next week. Anna was always good-natured, managing things in her own way, hearing his long lectures and reproofs with the most immovable philosophy, and his groans and wailings over her extravagance with the firmness of a stoic. She never thought of reasoning with him or rebelling at his unconscionable long philippics on the extravagance of the age. She adjusted the rich braids of her hair, arranged her muslins, and altered and fixed till all looked becoming with perfect nonchalance. He lectured and she listened, and so it passed day after day. 'Tis true, when he heard the merry tones of her voice half bantering with a customer, he would seem to be on nettles till he was gone. He often urged her to keep out of the shop door, and not peep so often from the window. But all to no purpose. She had a pretty face, and she would show it, a becoming dress, and the neighbors should know it. The men might admire, and the women envy. Sometimes the poor grocer would just get his head down into the pork barrel to weigh a piece for the purchaser, when the lively tones of his wife's voice would arrest his ear, and in his eagerness to see who she was talking to, down would go the piece of pork, splattering the brine in every direction and wasting salt enough for a man's dinner. He once wasted 2 or 3 gallons of molasses, a loss which he deplored for months afterwards, in his eagerness to run upstairs to see who was talking with his wife, and the measure in the meanwhile was depositing all it could not hold on the cellar floor. He spilt the sugar, scattered the tea, and all on his wife's account. She kept him in a constant fidget, while she seemed entirely undisturbed herself. Some of my readers, perhaps, will think little Anna a marvelously happy wife, while some will believe she had a goodly share of trials. Some will commiserate the condition of poor Mr. G., while others will believe he deserved it. At any rate, if their lives answered no other purpose, they served to teach them one general truth, viz., that the superannuated old miser who marries a giddy girl, hoping to make a saving in expenditure, will generally find himself woefully mistaken, and the inconsiderate girl who marries without affection or respect, only with the hope of gratifying a silly vanity, will be pretty sure to wish her cake was dough again. End of section 7.
Section 8 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 20. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sonia. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 20, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 8. To Juliet, a Night Thought. In yonder taper's waning light, an image of my heart I see. It burns amid a lonely night, its life the love of thee. The steadfast light its passion takes, but slowly wastes while it illumes, and while my very life it makes, my life itself consumes. End of section 8.
Section 9 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 20. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by AllenO Impara. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 20, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 9. A Tale of an Old Highlander by James Hogg, the Ettrick Shepherd. When I was a shepherd at Willensley, There came to that place in the summer of 1789 a little old Highlander, whose name was Alexander Stewart, but who had all his life been distinguished by the name of Boyg from his father's farm. He remained with us all summer and harvest, and I think I never was so sorry at parting with a neighbor servant of the same sex before. He was what the rest of the servants called a shrewd, sensible body, indeed far, far above the people of that rank in Scotland. He had served both in America and at Gibraltar, and told me wonderful stories of both. The rest of the servants accounted all these stories lies, but not so with me. I swallowed them all as genuine truth, and if they were not so, they certainly told very like truth. "How did you come to lose all your foreteeth, Boyg?" said I to him one day as we were reaping together. He instantly laid his sickle on his shoulder, put a hand to each side, felt his mouth with his forefinger, and said, "Why, boy, I lost them at Gibraltar by a very singular accident. You see, I was stationed at a cannon on the countermare, and by there comes a Spanish 26-pounder, with such a de-whiz that the very wind of it threw me 20 yards to the left, about away from the battlement, where, falling on the pavement, I knocked out the whole of me teeth, as you see." "How did you come to know the weight of the ball so exactly, Boyg?" "Why, because I weighed it." "Weighed it? How did you catch it going at such a rate?" "Oh, bless your soul, boy! It struck the rook right behind my station and killed 2 men in rebounding, and so, he having proved such an extraordinary fellow, we weighed him. We gathered up their balls as thick as peas and groats, and we returned them again with interest." But the story which I set out with the design of telling was one which I made him tell several times over, and which he did with no variation that I could mark. He was witness to all the transactions himself, as far as a livery servant could be witness to them, and those often know more of the secrets and concerns of a family than their most intimate acquaintances do. I cannot vouch for the truth of the narrative, having no authority for it but Boyg's words. It is therefore with diffidence that I mention the names and titles of the actors. But without doing so, I cannot tell the story at all, which I shall give in very nearly his own words. I cannot conceive who Lady Livingston was. The rest of the names will answer for themselves if such men really were, for I do not know. "I was chief servant with old Lady Livingston in Edinburgh for many years, and was frequently trusted by gentlemen with messages and letters to her niece, Barbara Stewart, by far the greatest beauty of her day. She was held up beside as a great fortune, but as to that I can say nothing. She was heiress to her aunt, that is certain, and I believe to some trifling estates round Perthshire. However, she had plenty of suitors, for I believe there was not a young nobleman in the kingdom who ever saw her face that did not fall in love with her. It seemed to be the fashion of the day to be in love with Barbara, and to be seen with her in public was sufficient to introduce a young man into genteel society. Those were grand days for me, for I took bribes from everybody and served nobody. Lady Livingston was strict and severe on the beauty. Consequently, there were private appointments to make, and billets doux without end to deliver, by which I was the only profiteer, besides my young mistress, to whom presents poured in of the richest value. As far as I could judge of Miss Stewart, she was exceedingly volatile and gallantish. She loved to dance about with her handsome young gentlemen, and with noblemen in particular, and whether or not she meant to give them all encouragement I cannot tell. But it were manifest the greater part of them thought they were encouraged and persevered in their intentions. But of all the suitors, Captain James Drummond, son to the Earl of Mitford, was a favourite with Lady Livingston. Her high notions of noble descent, ancient and dignified lineage, with prospects of future greatness, secured her interest in his favour, and she ceased not teasing her niece early and late about the captain's high qualities. Barbara had nothing to say against them. She seemed quite indifferent, and liked them just as well as any other, answering her aunt with some general remark as, "Indeed, is he so very accomplished? Well, I declare I should hardly have discovered it if you had not told me. Thank you, my dear aunt." "Order." "Well, I believe it. Or how can I do otherwise, when my dear aunt tells me so?
The young soldier is good enough, without doubt, to those who love him, and too good for those who love him and cannot get him. Hi-ho! Well, baby, my dear, I have no wish to force your inclinations, but I have more nieces than you. That is some comfort, you know. And if you are determined to live and die an old maid... Oh, shocking!
Screamed Barbara.
I live and die an old maid! I declare I shall faint. Oh, dear aunt, what thought of me brought such a horrid expression into your mouth? He, live and die an old maid!
A shriek.
Boy, I beseech you, go with my compliments to Captain Drummond, and desire him to come here on the instant. What do you laugh at, you impertinent dog?
I beg your pardon, Miss Barbara, said I. I have been guilty of a great breach of good manners, but on me soul I could not help it. Your terrible hurry in sending for Captain Drummond. Are you quite serious?
Yes, perfectly serious. Tell him that I have something very serious to say to him, and my aunt has something very particular to say to him.
But are you quite sure, madam, that I shall get into the castle at this late hour, or that if I were to get in, that it's improbable he will get out?
He can come over the wall, you know. You can let him down by a rope. Be sure to take a good, long, strong rope with you, for he must come. That's flat. My aunt has given me such a fright that I shall not get out of it again till I am married. Go instantly, for I wish to see the captain first, who is so agreeable to my aunt. For the first man that pops the question to me now, I'll chap him, that I will. Was there ever such a madcap?
Exclaimed Lady Livingston, holding up her hands.
Take away these things, Boyg, and go to your bed. Does the buoyant jilt suppose that she is to make fools of herself and me? I'll teach her otherwise. Whatever is done under my roof shall be done decently and in order. What? Send for a young officer, express after supper? The girl's distracted, moonstruck.
Barbara was evidently enjoying her freak, and her aunt lost her temper, for as I was retiring, she cast to me a look so languishing, and at the same time so sly, that I was speeding out at the door for the fear of again bursting forth with laughter. But she called me back, and continuing the same expression of countenance, said,
Boyg, I say, Boyg, pray have you ever thought of marrying?
This was said in a manner conveying the insinuation that in her forlorn circumstances she would willingly marry me that very night. The old lady sprang to her feet in a great rage, or rather consternation, thinking her darling niece seized by a fit of lunacy. I clashed the door closed behind me and fled, actually perspiring suppressed laughter. It is nothing to tell this story, but had you seen it acted as I did, it was exquisite. The next day Captain Drummond came. Whether sent for it or not, I cannot tell. I suspect that he was, for one of the girls brought in the caddy after breakfast. He remained with the ladies all the forenoon, and they were denied to everyone else. I was only once in with a chicken and some wine, and shall never forget the scene. There was my lady, sitting with all the importance of a great diplomatess, turning her benevolent looks on the honourable captain, as she always styled him. There was Barbara, with looks as demure as a devotee's, and as innocent as a lamb. But well I could see the lurking mischief in them, and that she was playing the devil with Captain Drummond's heart, misleading him in the most serious concern of life, and actually doing all that she could to make a fool of him, while at the same time he was gazing on her with a fondness which I never saw equalled. I don't know what passed that day. I would have given anything in life to have heard, but could not. I rather suppose that the minx was carrying on the same lesson as the evening before, and was all complaisance and condescension. Certain it is, the match was concluded that day, for so it afterward appeared. At least that Captain Drummond supposed the match concluded. That there was another supposed no such thing, I was quite convinced. I knew her well. A finer form or lovelier sure I never beheld. But there was a piquancy and sly, restless mischievousness in her disposition quite peculiar. She flaunted and dashed on as usual without the least difference,
and with much less restraint from her old aunt, who was pleased with her darling's complaisance. And moreover, the division of the 42nd Regiment then in the castle was ordered into Sussex to join the rest of the regiment, so that Captain Drummond was separated from his adored Miss Stuart for an indefinite space of time. It made no difference with Barbara. On she went, receiving new lovers almost every day, and treating them even more kindly than before. The principal lover now was Mr. John Lyon, likewise a sprig of nobility, a great puppy, very handsome, proud and overbearing, and rather kept other lovers aloof by his boldness and importance, than tried to make an impression on the lady's heart by kindness and condescension. Whether she ever cherished a thought of marrying this young man or not, it is impossible to say, for no living man could calculate on her motives from her actions. Perhaps she did, for the greatest coquette keeps an eye forward to marriage as a ne plus ultra of gallantry. She gave him at this time decidedly the preference to all others, of which he made a very haughty use, pushing himself between her and other gallants without ceremony, saving only saying, "Begging your pardon, sir," or something to the same purpose. Matters were in this state when there arrived from London an Honourable Mr. John Drummond, who brought several letters of introduction from noble Jacobites' families there, and among others, one to Lady Livingston, stating that he was only son to the late Edward Drummond, Duke of Perth, and the lineal heir of the great Perth estates, on the removal of the forfeitures, which were then under consideration. The young man was in consequence of this greatly caressed, and by none more than Lady Livingston, who all but worshipped him. He had been born and bred in France, and was a thorough Frenchman, all flattery, wit, and good humour, and the very man for Barbara Stuart. Here my description falls far short of the original story-seller, for he had all the Frenchman's motions, his bows, his capers, and his wit, which was 10 times more diverting in his broken English and French mixed. I used to laugh immoderately at Boyg's exhibition of the Duke of Perth, his good humor with the young lady, and his flattery of the old one. It must have been exquisite. Well, truth to say, he was at once the adopted sweetheart, for to see Barbara Stuart was to be in love with her, and this great heir to the Perth estates being taken captive at once, plied his flattery, his bows, and his fantastic motions with so good an effect that Barbara Stuart actually was won, to the great delight of Lady Livingston, who thought no more of Captain Drummond, Highland cousin to the new wooer, but acquiesced most liberally in his proposals. But then Mr. Lyon had gained a real or supposed footing, and his pride and contumacy were not likely to be evilly overborne. Of this Mr. Drummond knew nothing, but gallanted his beloved openly, to the great despite of many a lovelorn youth. They visited together many of the old Jacobite families, and at Lord Rollo's fell in with Lyon, who evidently laid himself out to insult the new favourite, and even condescended to the meanness of addressing him by the title of Duc de Put. Drummond, however, put off everything with some reply that set the whole party in a roar of laughter. He held up his hands, straddled with his knees, turned up the whites of his eyes. "Ah, Duc de Pert, very happy, assez propre, thank you, Monsieur Lyon, much obliger, great obligation." The next day being fine, Mr. Drummond and Barbara went out to take a private walk, and at the south point of a place called Burnsfield Links, Mr. Lyon came up with them. He called at Lady Livingston's house in the Horsewind. I answered the door and told him which way the lovers had gone. He followed, apparently in a bad humor, and overtaking them at the place mentioned, he, as usual, pushed himself rudely in between them, with a "begging your pardon, sir, but if you please." "What? I plays? No, I plays no such thing, and I will see you to damnation before I submit to any such treatment. So stand you aside like a gentlewoman." At the same time, Barbara drew her restaurant from Lyon and said, "Pray, what is the meaning of this, Mr. Lyon? Who gave you a right to take such freedoms with me?"
Who gave me a right, madam? Exclaimed he fiercely. I! Who gives you the right, sir? Asked the Frenchman. Was it the laddie, or was it I? Because without the one or the other or both, you cannot be here. And with that again, he took Miss Barbara Stewart's thrilling arm. Leon was galled beyond what his proud and insolent nature could endure, and cursing Drummond for an impostor, he struck him a violent blow, bidding him make the best of that he could. Sir, I will not fight like a beggar, but if you be a gentleman, which I will see you are not, please to draw at your rapier, and I will thrust you through and through like body. Oh, ye have no weapons. No, ye come here like a Blackmore guard to be gentle home that have weapons, thinking you safe. But do you take that? And with that, Drummond gave him 2 hearty kicks, presenting at the same time his sharp rapier in such a manner that it was impossible for his antagonist to return them. There was now no alternative. A challenge from Leon was the consequence. The Master of Rollo and Dr. Graham were the seconds. The rivals met that evening on the spot where they had quarreled, and Drummond, having the choice of weapons, chose the rapier, by the cause that he knew older along with him, and it will do, he said. Leon acquiesced without hesitation, and soon proved that he was no novice in the art. They fought with great coolness and caution, and with as much ease as if they had been playing with foils. Leon drew the first blood, wounding Mr. Drummond rather slightly below the right arm and across the shoulder. The Master of Rollo then interfered, protesting against further violence, and strange to say, the wounded acquiesced. But the other refused, saying it was a mere scratch. He would have the insulting dog's heart's blood. What I do, you say, Sue? Cried Drummond. Then for the dernier resort. They then fought very hard and close for the space of a minute and a half, when Drummond run him through the body, and the young man was carried home a corpse. Drummond retired to the nominal concealment for a while, but on trial was fairly exculpated. Shortly after that, Miss Barbara Stewart and he were married. In the interim, word had reached Captain Drummond at headquarters how matters were likely to end with his betrothed and his cousin. He therefore got leave of absence for a while and posted to Edinburgh. But ere he arrived, the marriage was consummated. He had loved with all the warmth of his noble nature, and was so affected by Barbara's deceit and ingratitude that he felt sick and scarcely spoke or saw the light for nearly a month. But perhaps during a part of this time he had been studying the most ample revenge, which he soon found the means of putting in practice. He conceived himself to have been exceedingly ill-used, and without seeing either Barbara or the fortunate lover, he had again posted to the regiment, and from thence to London. Hitherto no one had doubted that Mr. John Drummond, husband of Barbara Stewart, was the true and lineal heir to the great Perth estate. I cannot be sure that I recollect exactly the relationship, although often minutely described to me by Boyg. But I think his father was uncle to James, the first Duke of Perth, and on the decease of the latter at St. Germain, this John's father, the Lord Edward Drummond, assumed the title. He spent all his life in the interior of France in religious seclusion, and this John was the only surviving child of him and his wife, Lady Elizabeth Middleton, both of whom were dead, so that there could be no doubt as to his right of succession. Captain Drummond, however, saw matters in a different light. Although 3 or 4 degrees farther removed, he perceived how difficult it would be for his rival to adduce sufficient evidence of his legitimacy from the interior of France, considering the secluded life of his father and the then state of that kingdom. The captain, seizing the opportunity, went boldly forward and accused his rival as an impostor, and claimed the property for himself. He, having the best advocates of the kingdom, the lords admitted the plea, and ordered the former claimant to produce the proofs of his propinquity. Mr. Drummond was astonished at the news. He hastened to London, taking his wife with him, and from thence to Douai, in Flanders, where he was born, from thence to Lyon, in pursuit of proper witnesses, which journey took him the greater part of a year. In the meantime, Captain Drummond had instituted a keen inquiry at home, and had even brought forward those who deposed that Lady Edward Drummond never had a child. And there certainly were some letters produced which, if genuine, went far to prove the truth of the statement. The consequence was that before John Drummond's return to England, the minds of the lords were made up regarding the right of possession, and although they waited his arrival, it was more for form's sake than a persuasion of the validity of his claims. He came to London at length, and produced a register of his birth from the Catholic College of Douai, but the other party prevailed in procuring its rejection, owing to its non-correspondence with other dates. He brought also plenty of witnesses, who proved his having been brought up and educated as the son of Lord Edward Drummond and of his wife Lady Elizabeth Middleton. But they proved of no avail regarding his birth by that lady, there having been counter-evidence produced which, in the eye of the law, was more decisive. The consequence, in short, was that after a tedious litigation, it was at last finally decided in the Court of Sessions at Edinburgh in favor of Captain James Drummond of the Milford family, who became thereby possessed of the Perth property. Never was a retaliation over a successful rival in love more complete than this was, as it left John Drummond and his wife totally ruined in their circumstances and deprived of their hopes. Boyd went abroad with them when they went in search of evidence, and on reaching Calais on their way home, Lady Perth, as she had been styled ever since her marriage, was left behind, being unable from the state she was in to proceed further, and Boyd remained with her. She was there delivered of a son, but was so meanly lodged, and left so poor, that she was obliged to borrow from Boyd till he had not a sixpence left. In this wretched state was the once celebrated beauty lying, when her husband, after long absence, returned to France, with the news that they were utterly ruined. But this was not the worst. Her husband had published an article in some London journal, I think a magazine, wherein he accused Captain Drummond, then Lord Perth, of the most grievous malpractices against him, of suborning false witnesses and keeping back others, and altogether with charges so villainous that they could not be overlooked. It would have been better had they been so, as uttered by an irritated, disappointed man. But the high spirit of Lord Perth would not submit to it. He followed his relation to Calais, accompanied by Major McGlashan of the 21st, and after vainly endeavoring to draw from Mr. Drummond a counterstatement, challenged him. But the circumstance that rendered his tale so interesting to me at first, and impressed all the circumstances so strongly on my remembrance, is yet to narrate. For without something a little tinged with the supernatural, a tale has few charms for me. Well, it so happened that one fine pleasant day, as Mr. John Drummond was walking by himself on Burnsfield Links at Edinburgh, near by the scene of the fatal rencounter with John Lyon, that gentleman came up to him alive and well, and asked him how he liked to be married. The other, struck with astonishment, made no answer, but stood and gazed at the querist, who again accosting him, said, "You deprive me foully of my love and my life, Drummond, but I shall be even with you today, and the next time I meet with you, I'll shoot you through here," touching his head with the point of his forefinger close above the right ear. The vision, of course, proved a dream, for instead of being walking on Burnsfield Links, he was lying in his own chamber in the Horsewind, with his lovely Barbara in his arms. But the moment that the apparition touched him with its finger, he sprung from his bed and exclaimed that he was shot through the head. His lady started up in amazement, crying out, "How? Where? By whom?" "By that scoundrel Lyon," said he. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. The sun was shining into the room, and when Barbara received this answer, she grew pale as death, thinking her husband was deranged. "It is true," exclaimed he wildly. I am shot through the head, and my brains are blown out. Look and satisfy yourself at the hole the bullet has made. Merciful heaven, was I out on the links naked?" "You are raving, Drummond," cried she, weeping and throwing her arms around him. "Seized by some mortal frenzy, I fear. Compose yourself and lie down, for you were out nowhere, but lying sound asleep with me." He got his head bound up and lay down, trying to compose himself, but his ideal wound was so painful that he continued in an agony until a letter was brought upstairs to him. It was that which stated to him the new claims of his rival on the Perth estate, and the strong doubts entertained of his own propinquity. This was a most galling business, and the anxiety of mind that it threw him into completely eradicated the vision and the wound from his head. Nor did he ever think of them more until the same vision was repeated to him at Calais. He dreamed that he was walking on Burnsfield links, and Mr. Lyon came up to him and asked how he liked to be married. The dreamer still had no power to reply, while the other continued, "You deprived me foully of my love and my life, Drummond, and sent me all unprepared to my account. But I am even with you now, and am come to fulfill my promise. Be expeditious, and I will wait here till I take you with me." Drummond started up in a cold perspiration with terror and astonishment, and just as he was saying to his wife that he was going to die and would never see the evening of that day, the door opened and Boyd handed him a note from Major McGlashan. Notwithstanding this solemn and dreadful warning, Drummond refused to retract one item of what he had published and signed with his name, and the event was that he fought with Lord Perth and was shot through the head at the first fire, the ball entering immediately above the right ear on the very spot where the apparition touched with its finger. The remainder of Barbara Stewart's history is too painful to relate. Poor Boyd, who left her at last having neither money nor clothes to come home with, often wept when speaking of her. With regard to the merits of the cause, I know nothing. It was Boyd's opinion that his master was the true and lineal heir, and from him I imbibed my ideas. He always admitted, however, that Captain Drummond, then Lord Perth, was an excellent man, a gentleman of high honor and integrity, indeed, greatly superior to the other in every respect, but never that he was the proper heir. Never was retaliation on a deceitful lover visited home with such an overpowering intensity. End of section 9.
Section 10 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 20. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 20, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 10, The Yellow Domino. In the latter part of the reign of Louis XV of France, the masquerade was an entertainment in high estimation, and was often given at immense cost on court days and such occasions of rejoicing. As persons of all ranks might gain admission to these spectacles, provided they could afford the purchase of the ticket, very strange rencontres frequently took place at them, and exhibitions almost as curious in the way of disguise or assumption of character. But perhaps the most whimsical among the genuine surprises recorded at any of these spectacles was that which occurred in Paris the 15th of October, on the day when the Dauphin, son of Louis XV, attained the age of 21. At this fete, which was of a peculiarly glittering character, so much so that the details of it are given at great length by historians of the day, the strange demeanour of a man in a yellow domino early in the evening excited attention. This mask, who showed nothing remarkable as to figure, though tall rather and of robust proportion, seemed to be gifted with an appetite not merely past human conception, but passing the fancies even of romance. The dragon of old who churches ate, he used to come on a Sunday, whole congregations were to him but a dish of salmagundy. He was but a nibbler, a mere fool, to this stranger of the yellow domino. He passed from chamber to chamber, from table to table of refreshments, not tasting but devouring, devastating all before him. At one board he dispatched a fowl, 2/3 of a ham, and half a dozen bottles of champagne, and the very next moment he was found seated in another apartment, performing the same feat, with a stomach better than at first. This strange course went on until the company, who at first had been amused by it, became alarmed and tumultuous. "Is it the same mask, or are there several dressed alike?" demanded an officer of guards, as the yellow domino rose from a seat opposite to him and quitted the apartment. "I have seen but one, and, by heaven, here he is again!" exclaimed the party to whom the query was addressed. The yellow domino spoke not a word, but proceeded straight to the vacant seat which he had just left, and again commenced supping, as though he had fasted for the half of a campaign. At length the confusion which this proceeding created became universal, and the cause reached the ear of the Dauphin. "He is the very devil, your Highness," exclaimed an old nobleman, saving your Highness's presence, "or wants but a tale to be so." "Say rather he should be some famished poet by his appetite," replied the prince, laughing. "But there must be some juggling. He spills all his wine, and hides the provisions under his robe." Even while they were speaking, the yellow domino entered the room in which they were talking, and, as usual, proceeded to the table of refreshments. "See here, my lord," cried one, "I have seen him do this thrice. I twice, I 5 times, and I 15. This was too much. The master of the ceremonies was questioned. He knew nothing, and the yellow domino was interrupted as he was carrying a bumper of claret to his lips. "The prince's desire is that monsieur who wears the yellow domino should unmask." The stranger hesitated. "The command with which his highness honours monsieur is perfectly absolute. Against that which is absolute there is no contending." The yellow man threw off his mask and domino, and proved to be a private trooper of the Irish Dragoons. "And in the name of gluttony, my good friend, not to ask how you gained admission, how have you contrived," said the prince, "to sup tonight so many times?" "Sire, I was but beginning to sup, with reverence be it said, when your royal message interrupted me." "Beginning!" exclaimed the Dauphin in amazement. "Then what is it I have heard and seen? Where are the herds of oxen that have disappeared, and the hampers of Burgundy? I insist upon knowing how this is." "It is, sire," returned the soldier, "may it please your grace, that the troop to which I belong is today on guard. We have purchased one ticket among us, and provided this yellow domino, which fits us all. By which means the whole of the front rank, being myself the last man, have supped, if the truth must be told, at discretion. And the leader of the rear rank, saving your highness's commands, is now waiting outside the door to take his turn." End of section 10, recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 11 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 20. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 20. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 11. A Country Apothecary by Miss Mary Russell Mitford. One of the most important personages in a small country town is the apothecary. He takes rank next after the rector and the attorney, and before the curate, and could be much less easily dispensed with than either of those worthies, not merely as holding fate and physic in his hand, but as the general and, as it were, official, associate, adviser, comforter, and friend of all ranks and all ages, of high and low, rich and poor, sick and well. I am no despiser of dignities, but 20 emperors shall be less intensely missed in their wide dominions than such a man as my friend John Hallett in his own small sphere. The spot which was favoured with the residence of this excellent person was the small town of Hazelby in Dorsetshire, a pretty little place where everything seems at a standstill. It was originally built in the shape of the letter T, a long broad market-place, still so called, although the market be gone, serving for the perpendicular stem, traversed by a straight, narrow, horizontal street to answer for the top line. Not one addition has occurred to interrupt this architectural regularity, since, 50 years ago, a rich London tradesman built, at the west end of the horizontal street, a wide-fronted single house, with 2 low wings, iron palisades before, and a fish pond opposite, which still goes by the name of New Place, and is balanced at the east end of the street by an erection of nearly the same date, a large, square, dingy mansion enclosed within high walls, inhabited by 3 maiden sisters, and called, probably by way of nickname, the Nunnery. New Place being on the left of the road, and the Nunnery on the right, the T has now something the air of the italic capital T, turned up at one end and down at the other. The latest improvements are the bow window in the market-place, commanding the pavement both ways, which the late brewer, Andrews, threw out in his snug parlour some 20 years back, and where he used to sit smoking, with the sash up, in summer afternoons, enjoying himself, good man. And the great room at the Swan, originally built by the speculative publican Joseph Allwright for an assembly room. The speculation did not answer. The assembly, in spite of canvassing and patronage, and the active exertions of all the young ladies in the neighbourhood, dwindled away and died at the end of 2 winters. Then it became a club room for the hunt, but the hunt quarrelled with Joseph's cookery. Then a market room for the farmers, but the farmers, it was in the high price time, quarrelled with Joseph's wine. Then it was converted into the magistrate's room, the bench. But the bench and the market went away together, and there was an end of justicing. Then Joseph tried the novel attraction, to borrow a theatrical phrase, of a billiard table. But, alas! that novelty succeeded as ill as if it had been theatrical. There were not customers enough to pay the marker. At last it has merged finally in that unconscious receptacle of pleasure and pain, a post office. Although Hazelby has so little to do with traffic of any sort, even the traffic of correspondence, that a saucy mail coach will often carry on its small bag and as often forget to call for the London bag in return. In short, Hazelby is an insignificant place. My readers will look for it in vain in the map of Dorsetshire. It is omitted, poor dear town, left out by the map maker with as little remorse as a dropped letter. Sad it is also an old-fashioned place. It has not even a cheap shop for female gear. Everything in the one store which it boasts, kept by Martha Dean, linen draper and haberdasher, is dear and good as things were wont to be. You may actually get there thread made of flax, from the gauty, uneven, clumsy, shiny fabric, yclept white-brown, to the delicate commodity of lisle, used for darning muslin. I think I was never more astonished from the mere force of habit than when, on asking for thread, I was presented, instead of the pretty lattice-wound balls or snowy reels of cotton, with which that demand is usually answered, with a whole drawful of skeins peeping from their blue papers. Such skeins as in my youth a thrifty maiden would draw into the nicely stitched compartments of that silken repository, a housewife, or fold into a congeries of graduated thread papers, fine by degrees and beautifully less. The very literature of Hazelby is doled out at the pastry cook's, in a little one-windowed shop kept by Matthew Wise. Tarts occupy one end of the counter, and reviews the other, while the shelves are parcelled out between books and dolls and gingerbread. It is a question by which of his trades poor Matthew gains least. He is so shabby, so threadbare, and so starved. Such a town would hardly have known what to do with a highly informed and educated surgeon, such as one now generally sees in that most liberal profession. My friend John Hallett suited it exactly. His predecessor, Mr. Simon Saunders, had been a small, wrinkled, spare old gentleman with a short cough and a thin voice, who always seemed as if he needed an apothecary himself. He wore generally a full suit of drab, a flaxen wig of the sort a Bob Jerome, and a very tight muslin stock, a costume which he had adopted in his younger days in imitation of the most eminent physician of the next city, and continued to the time of his death. Perhaps the cough might have been originally an imitation also, engrafted on the system by habit. It had a most unsatisfactory sound, and seemed more like a trick than a real effort of nature. His talk was civil, prosy, and fidgety, much addicted to small scandal, and that kind of news which passes under the denomination of tittle-tattle. He was sure to tell one half of the town where the other drank tea, and recollected the blancmanges and jellies on a supper table, or described a new gown with as much science and unction as if he had been used to make jellies and wear gowns in his own person. Certain professional peculiarities might have favoured the supposition. His mode of practice was exactly that popularly attributed to old women. He delighted in innocent remedies, manna, magnesia, and camphor julep, never put on a blister in his life, and would sooner from pure complacence let a patient die than administer an unpalatable prescription. So qualified, to say nothing of his gifts in tea drinking, casino, and quadrille, whist was too many for him. His popularity could not be questioned. When he expired, all Hazelby mourned. The lamentation was general. The women of every degree, to borrow a phrase from that great phrasemonger Horace Walpole, cried quarts, and the procession to the churchyard, that very churchyard to which he had himself attended so many of his patients was now followed by all of them that remained alive. It was felt that the successor of Mr. Simon Saunders would have many difficulties to encounter. My friend, John Hallett, came and saw and overcame. John was what is usually called a rough diamond. Imagine a short, clumsy, stout-built figure, almost as broad as it is long, crowned by a bullet head, covered with shaggy brown hair, sticking out in every direction. The face round and solid, with a complexion originally fair, but dyed one red by exposure to all sorts of weather. Open, good-humoured eyes of a greenish cast. His admirers called them hazel. A wide mouth, full of large white teeth, a cocked-up nose and a double chin, bearing altogether a strong resemblance to a print which I once saw hanging up in an alehouse parlour of the celebrated divine, to use the identical words of the legend, Dr. Martin Luther. The condition of a country apothecary being peculiarly liable to the inclemency of the season, John's dress was generally such as might bid defiance to wind or rain or snow or hail. If anything, he wrapped up most in the summer, having a theory that people were never so apt to take cold as in hot weather. He usually wore a bearskin greatcoat, a silk handkerchief over his cravat, top boots on those sturdy pillars his legs, a huge pair of overalls, and a hat, which from the day in which it first came into the possession to that in which it was thrown aside, never knew the comfort of being freed from its oilskin, never was allowed to display the glossy freshness of his sable youth. Poor dear hat! How its vanity, if hats have vanity, must have suffered. For certain its owner had none, unless a lurking pride in his own bluffness and bluntness may be termed such. He piqued himself on being a plain, downright Englishman, and on a voice and address pretty much like his apparel, rough, strong, and warm, fit for all weathers. A heartier person never lived. In his profession he was eminently skilful, bold, confident, and successful. The neighbouring physicians liked to come after Mr. Hallett. They were sure to find nothing to undo. And blunt and abrupt as was his general manner, he was kind and gentle in a sick room. Only nervous disorders, the pet diseases of Mr. Simon Saunders, he could not abide. He made short work with them, frightened them away as one does by children when they have the hiccup, or if the malady were pertinacious and would not go, he fairly turned off the patient. Once or twice, indeed, on such occasions, the patient got the start and turned him off. Mrs. Emery, for instance, the lady's maid at New Place, most delicate and mincing of waiting gentlewomen, motioned him from her presence, and Miss Dean, daughter of Martha Dean, haberdasher, who, after completing her education at a boarding school, kept a closet full of millinery in a little den behind her mamma's shop, and was by many degrees the finest lady in Hazelby, was so provoked at being told by him that nothing ailed her, that, to prove her weakly condition, she pushed him by main force out of doors. With these exceptions, Mr. Hallett was the delight of the whole town, as well as all the farmhouses within 6 miles. He just suited the rich yeomanry, cured their diseases, and partook of their feasts, was constant at christenings, and a man of prime importance at weddings. A country merrymaking was nothing without the doctor. He was the very prince of good fellows, had a touch of epicurism which, without causing any distaste of his own homely face, made dainties acceptable when they fell in his way, was a most absolute carver, prided himself upon a sauce of his own invention for fish and game. Hazelby sauce, he called it, and was universally admitted to be the best compounder of a bowl of punch in the country. Besides these rare convivial accomplishments, his gay and jovial temper rendered him the life of the table. There was no resisting his droll faces, his droll stories, his jokes, his tricks, or his laugh, the most contagious cachinnation that ever was heard. Nothing in the shape of fun came amiss to him. He would join in a catch or roar out a solo, which might be heard a mile off, would play at hunt the slipper or blind man's buff, was a great man in a country dance, and upon very extraordinary occasions would treat the company to a certain remarkable hornpipe, which put the walls in danger of tumbling about their ears, and belonged to him as exclusively as the Hazelby sauce. It was a sort of parody on a pas seul which he had once seen at the Opera House, in which his face, his figure, his costume, his rich humour, and his strange, awkward, unexpected activity told amazingly. The force of frolic could no farther go than the doctor's hornpipe. It was the climax of jollity. But the chief scene of Mr. Hallett's gaiety lay out of doors, in a very beautiful spot called the Down, a sloping upland about a mile from Hazelby, a side view of which, with its gardens and orchards, its pretty church peeping from among lime and yew trees, and the fine piece of water called Hazelby Pond, it commanded. The Down itself was an extensive tract of land, covered with the finest verdure, backed by a range of hills, and surrounded by coppice wood, large patches of which were scattered over the turf like so many islands on an emerald sea. Nothing could be more beautiful or more impenetrable than these thickets. They were principally composed of birch, holly, hawthorn, and maple, woven together by garlands of woodbine, interwreathed and intertwisted by bramble and briar, till even the sheep, although the bits of their snowy fleece left on the bushes bore witness to the attempt, could make no way in the leafy mass. Here and there a large oak or beech rose towering above the rich underwood, and all around, as far as the eye could pierce, the borders of this natural shrubbery were studded with a countless variety of woodland flowers. When the old thorns were in blossom, or when they were succeeded by the fragrant woodbine and the delicate briar rose, it was like a garden, if it were possible to fancy any garden so peopled with birds. The only human habitation on this charming spot was the cottage of the shepherd, old Thomas Tolfree, who, with his granddaughter Jemima, a little pretty maiden of 14, tended the flocks on the down, and the rustic carols of this little lass and the tinkling of the sheep bells were usually the only sounds that mingled with the sweet songs of the feathered tribes. On Mondays and holidays, however, the thickets resounded with other notes of glee than those of the linnet and the woodlark. Fairs, revels, May games, and cricket matches, all were holden on the down, and there would John Hallett sit, in his glory, universal umpire and referee of cricketer, wrestler, or backsword player, the happiest and greatest man in the field. Little Jemima never failed to bring her grandfather's armchair and place it under the old oak for the good doctor. I question whether John would have exchanged his throne for that of the King of England. On these occasions he certainly would have been the better for that convenience, which he piqued himself on not needing, a partner. Generally speaking, he really, as he used to boast, did the business of 3 men. But when a sickly season and a Maying happened to come together, I cannot help suspecting that the patients had the worst of it. Perhaps, however, a partner might not have suited him. He was sturdy and independent to the verge of a fault, and would not have brooked being called to account, or brought to a reckoning by any man under the sun. Still less could he endure the thought of that more important and durable copartnery, marriage. He was a most determined bachelor, and so afraid of being mistaken for a wooer, or incurring the reputation of a gay deceiver, that he was as uncivil as his good nature would permit to every unwedded female from 16 to 60, and had nearly fallen into some scrapes on that account with the spinsters of the town, accustomed to the soft silkiness of Mr. Simon Saunders. But they got used to it. It was the man's way. And there was an indirect flattery in his fear of the charms which the maiden ladies, especially the elder ones, found very mollifying. So he was forgiven. In his shop and his household he had no need either of partner or of wife. The one was excellently managed by an old rheumatic journeyman, slow in speech and of vinegar aspect, who had been a pedagogue in his youth, and now used to limp about with his livy in his pocket, and growl as he compounded the medicines over the bad Latinity of the prescriptions. The other keeper and a cherry-cheeked niece, the orphan daughter of his only sister, who kept everything within doors in the bright and shining order in which he delighted. John Hallett, notwithstanding the roughness of his aspect, was rather knick-knacky in his tastes, a great patron of small inventions, such as the improved ne plus ultra corkscrew, and the latest patent snuffers. He also trifled with horticulture, dabbled in tulips, was a connoisseur in pinks, and had gained a prize for polyanthuses. The garden was under the especial care of his pretty niece, Miss Susan, a grateful, warm-hearted girl, who thought she never could do enough to please her good uncle, and prove her sense of his kindness. He was indeed as fond of her as if he had been her father, and as kind. Perhaps there was nothing very extraordinary in his goodness to the gentle and cheerful little girl, who kept his walks so trim and his parlour so neat, who always met him with a smile, and who, last and strongest tie to a generous mind, was wholly dependent on him, had no friend on earth but himself. There was nothing very uncommon in that, but John Hallett was kind to everyone, even where the sturdy old English prejudices, which he cherished as virtues, might seem most likely to counteract his gentler feelings. One instance of his benevolence and delicacy shall conclude this sketch. Several years ago, an old French emigree came to reside at Hazelby. He lodged at Matthew Wise's, of whose twofold shop for cakes and novels I have before made honourable mention, in the low three-cornered room with a closet behind it, which Matthew had the impudence to call his first floor. Little was known of him but that he was a thin, foreign-looking gentleman, who shrugged his shoulders in speaking, took a great deal of snuff, and made a remarkably low bow. The few persons with whom he had any communication spoke with amusement of his bad English, and with admiration of his good humour, and it soon appeared from a written paper placed in a conspicuous part of Matthew's shop that he was an abbé, and that he would do himself the honour of teaching French to any of the nobility or gentry of Hazelby who might think fit to employ him. Pupils dropped in rather slowly. The curate's daughters and the attorney's son, and Miss Dean the milliner, but she found the language difficult and left off, asserting that Monsieur l'Abbé's snuff made her nervous. At last poor Monsieur l'Abbé fell ill himself, really ill, dangerously ill, and Matthew Wise went in all haste to summon Mr. Hallett. Now Mr. Hallett had such an aversion to a Frenchman, in general, as a cat has to a dog, and was wont to erect himself into an attitude of defiance and wrath at the mere sight of the object of his antipathy. He hated and despised the whole nation, abhorred the language, and would as lief, he assured Matthew, have been called in to a toad. He went, however, grew interested in the case, which was difficult and complicated, exerted all his skill, and in about a month accomplished a cure. By this time he had also become interested in his patient, whose piety, meekness, and resignation had won upon him in an extraordinary degree. The disease was gone, but a languor and lowness remained, which Mr. Hallett soon traced to a less curable disorder, poverty. The thought of the debt to himself evidently weighed on the poor Abbé's spirits, and our good apothecary at last determined to learn French purely to liquidate his own long bill. It was the drollest thing in the world to see this pupil of 50, whose habits were so entirely unfitted for a learner, conning his task, or to hear him conjugating the verb avoir, or blundering through the first phrases of the easy dialogues. He was a most unpromising scholar, shuffled the syllables together in a manner that would seem incredible, and stumbled at every step of the pronunciation, against which his English tongue rebelled amain. Every now and then he solaced himself with a fluent volley of execrations in his own language, which the Abbé understood well enough to return, after rather a politer fashion, in French. It was a most amusing scene. But the motive, the generous, noble motive. Monsieur l'Abbé, after a few lessons, detected this delicate artifice, and, touched almost to tears, insisted on dismissing his pupil, who, on his side, declared that nothing should induce him to abandon his studies. At last they came to a compromise. The cherry-cheeked Susan took her uncle's post as a learner, which she filled in a manner much more satisfactory, and the good old Frenchman not only allowed Mr. Hallett to administer gratis to his ailments, but partook of his Sunday dinner as long as he lived. End of section 11.
Section 12 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 20. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 20, edited by Seba Smith and Labree. Section 12. The Mysterious Visitor. The following curious ballad first appeared some 13 years ago in The Collegian, published at Cambridge, Massachusetts, a sprightly periodical conducted principally by the students of the university. It was afterwards, we believe, acknowledged to be the production of Oliver Wendell Holmes, and, if we recollect right, was inserted in his volume of poems published a few years since. Mr. Holmes is an active member of the medical profession, and we presume gives but a small portion of his time to literary pursuits. But he has secured to himself a high rank among the bards of his country, and in humorous poetry especially he stands unrivalled. His verse has a very graceful and easy flow, his language is simple and natural, and his images are presented with a distinctness that gives them a peculiar charm. The Mysterious Visitor. There was a sound of hurrying feet, a tramp on echoing stairs. There was a rush along the aisles. It was the hour of prayers. And on, like ocean's midnight wave, the current rolled along, when suddenly a stranger form was seen amid the throng. He was a dark and swarthy man, that uninvited guest. A faded coat of bottle green was buttoned round his breast. There was not one among them all could well say whence he came, nor beardless boy nor ancient man could tell that stranger's name. All silent as the sheeted dead, in spite of sneer or frown, fast by a grey-haired senior's side he sat him boldly down. There was a look of horror flashed from out the tutor's eyes. When all around him rose to pray, the stranger did not rise. A murmur broke along the crowd, the prayer was at an end. With ringing heels and measured tread, 100 forms descend. Through sounding aisle or grating stair, the long procession poured, till all were gathered on the seats around the commons' board. That fearful stranger down he sat, unasked yet undismayed, and on his lips a rising smile of scorn or pleasure played. He took his hat and hung it up, with slow yet eager air. He stripped his coat from off his back, and placed it on a chair. Then from his nearest neighbour's side a knife and plate he drew, and reaching out his hand again, he took his teacup too. How fled the sugar from the bowl, how sunk the azure cream! They vanished like the shapes that float upon a summer dream. a long, long draught, an outstretched hand, and crackers, toast, and tea. They faded from the stranger's touch like dew upon the sea. Clouds were upon full many a brow, fear sat upon their souls, and in a bitter agony they clasped their buttered rolls. A whisper trembled through the crowd, who could the stranger be? And some were silent, for they thought a cannibal was he. What if the creature should arise, for he was stout and tall, and swallow down a sophomore, coat, crow's foot, cup, and all? All sullenly the stranger rose, they sat in mute despair. He took his hat from off the peg, his coat from off the chair. 4 freshmen fainted on the seat, 6 swooned upon the floor, yet on the fearful being passed, and shut the chapel door. There is full many a starving man that struts in bottle green, but never more that hungry one in Commons Hall was seen. Yet often in the sunset hour, when tolls the evening bell, the freshman lingers on the step, that frightful tale to tell. End of section 12, recording by Alan Mapstone. End of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 20, edited by Seba Smith and Labree.